Hey everyone, thanks for stopping by. Today we have Tom Putnam. He's a writer, producer, director straight out of Los Angeles, grew up in Portland, Oregon, and we're going to be discussing his film, The Dark Divide, which came out in 2020, starring David Cross, Deborah Messing, and some amazing other actors. We're going to talk about the process of filmmaking, we're going to talk about his journey as a filmmaker, we're going to talk about the lava tubes in Mount St. Helens, where people have supposedly seen Bigfoot. It's going to be an epic interview. Please like this video, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. Make sure you go watch The Dark Divide. It's available on Amazon, you can rent or buy it, or go to darkdividefilm.com where you'll be directed to other places where you can stream the movie. Well, welcome everyone. I'm so glad you could come today. This is a really special episode. I am honored to present to you a little bit from my dream movie, and that is the director, producer, and co-writer of The Dark Divide. This is Tom Putnam, and I'm thrilled that he's here today. Tom is a writer, producer, director, and actor, and you may recognize his work as a director and producer for a couple films, The Burn, Marwinkle, Broadcast 23, and like I said earlier, The Dark Divide. Tom is a documentary filmmaker and also has directed many beautiful commercials. And I have to say, Tom, real quickly, that anytime I watch one of your Ford commercials, I get a tear in my eye. So you're doing fantastic work for them.
Thanks, man.
Yeah,
Do you drive a Ford?
I drive a Ford 150. I do. So you can
Perfect.
imagine just how it is. My first car was when I was in high school was a 1975 white Ford 150, and now I drive the model that's 30 years older. So it's
Oh,
kind
that's
of,
amazing.
isn't that weird how life just comes together? So in 2020, Tom's film Dark Divide was released, and by far is in my top favorites, along with, well, The Shining, E.T., and Never Cry Wolf. But I have a lot of favorite films. But the film stars David Cross and Deborah Messing, amongst other fantastic actors such as David Kushner and comedian Cameron Esposito, who I'm absolutely in love with. I adore her. I wish I could name them all. Tom wrote this film with Robert Michael Pyle, a well-known author and researcher and lepodiatrist. We'll talk about that. We'll get into that process soon, but first, welcome, Tom. Thanks so much for being here. I'm so happy to have you here.
Hey, Russ, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, you are down in good old California. That's right.
I am, yes.
Tom, real quickly, I have a whole bunch of questions I wanted to ask you, but
Sure.
again, as we talked about earlier, if we get off topic, that's my favorite kind of chat. Can you first of all just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I grew up in suburban Portland, Oregon, and the 70s and 80s, and just the outdoors were a huge part of our lives. We basically spent every weekend hiking, fishing, camping, and I spent a lot of that time in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest in southern Washington, and then moved to LA to go to school. Ended up becoming a documentary filmmaker. Occasionally somebody lets me make a fiction film, which is awesome, and had just always missed those places that were so special to me. And now I have a son, he's 13, and his favorite things in the world are camping and fishing and hiking, and there's not a lot of opportunities to do that here. So it kind of helped me rediscover why those things were important to me. And then I read, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. Keep going. Yeah.
And then, 10 years ago, a friend gave me Robert Pyle's book, Where Bigfoot Walks, Crossing the Dark Divide. And it takes place in the exact trails and lakes and all the places that I grew up going to. It takes place a little bit after I was there, but within a decade. And a lot of the stuff he saw were things I saw in terms of the logging and its effect on the wilderness area there. And it just, wow, took me back to that place. And not just the wilderness, but that feeling of being out alone in the middle of, this old growth forest, and you hear something or you think you see something and you immediately, is that Bigfoot? And
Right.
I love the picture he painted of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to jump into all of the Gifford Pinchot experiences you've had. I think you and I have probably very similar upbringings, which sounds very intriguing. Mine was more in the Northern Cascades area. I didn't do a whole lot down at Gifford Pinchot, but I was usually up between Stevens and Snoqualmie Pass. I'm sure you know those right there that divides
For sure.
Washington in half. Yeah. So first of all, let's jump into this. What inspired you to enter the world of filmmaking?
Um, I first wanted to be an animator, but I can't draw.
Okay.
So I just started making short films, and I was always really interested in storytelling. Ended up going to school at University of Southern California and getting a degree in film production and also a degree in journalism. And there's a lot that's similar in those two things. So uh, ended up making documentary films. I still do love them, and I like to think that my documentaries feel like fiction films. So it was sort of a natural. With The Dark Divide, I kind of wrote it and tailored it specifically to make a feature film, but like a documentary. So kind of coming to it from the other perspective.
Well, and there's so many different topics that you talk about. And the nice thing that about your film and your storytelling is there's nothing preachy in the film whatsoever, but it brings to the surface so many different things: nature conservation, logging, as you said earlier, Native American approaches, and we'll jump into that in a second. But that, to me, when you take and you combine that documentary with that fictional, if you will, writing, I think that's what was so powerful about your film. And I keep pushing it on Instagram constantly because I want everybody in the world to see this. I really do.
Thank you.
I feel like I was I was following the announcements when it was coming out. I wasn't a huge Dave Cross follower. I mean, I Arrested Development, watching him walk around in jean shorts, Daisy Dukes all the time.
Uh,
But that was my introduction to Dave Cross, and then Will and Grace, obviously, with Deborah. But that, to me, is a powerful approach, and I think that's what I appreciate the most about the approach to the movie, why it's so appealing.
yeah, and I mean, I have my own opinions, but one of the things I like about Bob and his writing is he looks at things from every perspective, and it's pretty hard to sit down with somebody, no matter how much you disagree with them, even now, and not find things that you do agree on.
That's
Um,
true.
yeah, so we tried to get into that in the movie, but in a way that hopefully, yeah, isn't like finger pointing and preachy.
Right, right, absolutely. So how do you go about researching and considering a topic for a film? I want to talk about clowns at the end of the interview, by the way.
Oh, I bet, yeah. At the other end of that movie making
Right,
spectrum.
right.
So with Bob's book, which is the first time I had adapted a piece of nonfiction, it's a pretty thick book, and he deals with a lot of subjects, and the book jumps around in terms of the chronology. It was a really tough piece of material, but it was a really rich piece of material. And as I got to know Bob over the 10 years it took to get the movie made, I've said the first 7 of which were like writing and rewriting and trying to figure out how to take this story and make it feel like a movie. I learned a lot about the rest of his life. The film ultimately isn't just based on Where Bigfoot Walks, it's based on 7 of his other books as well. So he has such a huge body of work. A lot of what I did was kind of going through that and putting a timeline together. And without giving too much away, he goes through some things that are about as serious as anybody can in any of our lives. And
Mm.
he was really generous to let me incorporate that into the movie when some of those things weren't in Where Bigfoot Walks, they were just in his personal life. Learned and relearned a lot about Bigfoot and cryptozoology. Learned a lot about the Gifford Pinchot National Forest that I didn't know, even having spent so much time there. And just worked really hard, I think, to try to ground the film in what it was like in 1995, which is when his true story and the movie take place.
Do you, when you create a film like this and you meet new people and I learned a little bit about you on IMDb. Obviously, it's where most people go. But listening to people, how do you go about listening to people and taking what they may tell you? And I know you've read a lot of Bob's books, but how do you turn that into something that motivates you to tell stories, or what do you look for to create a unique story?
Oh, great question. For me, I get excited with something that introduces me to a world I don't know helps me see myself in people I don't think I would be able to see myself in, and has a unique way of telling a story, a unique outlook on the world. Um, I've been lucky in that most of the films I've been able to work on have done that, certainly in the documentary world. And Bob's book did that too. I mean, whether it's I'm working with people on a fiction film or interviewing somebody for a documentary, I kind of try to just shut up and listen. And I've found that I mean, it sounds stupid, but like the less I say, kind of the better things go. So like on Dark Divide, we had time to rehearse, which is such a like gift as a director. You don't always get that with David and Deborah. And they knew their characters really, really well. They both talked to family members and really had done a lot of research. So when it came time to shoot, I basically would just sort of set up like the boundaries and let them go. And coming from the doc world, I don't do a lot of takes. I usually do like, I mean, on Dark Divide, most things you're seeing are one, maybe two takes if there's a camera problem. And that was really, at first, I think terrifying for everybody else. But then they realized like, oh, wow, this is going to unfold once. And I think there's like an energy and an excitement. And when you see it, there's a scene where David and Deborah are in bed together, and it's a really important scene. And that sounds so sexy. It's a serious scene.
Yeah.
And we did it one take from one angle, one take from another angle, and they knew that going into it. And I think it kind of creates that magic where the reactions you see from the other actor when somebody does something are a lot more genuine than in the second take or the third take, because they don't know what's going to happen and they surprise themselves sometimes. And that's the part of filmmaking that's really exciting for me.
Sure. I think a lot of people talk about how in filmmaking, the live feeling of theater, which is my background, gets lost a little bit, because in the live, you're constantly feeding off that energy from an audience, and you're playing off that energy. And that's one thing I love about theater. And I know in film, you don't always have that audience reaction, And so I'm wondering if that has if you see a little difference in that with, like you say, a first or a second take.
Yeah, there's definitely, the first take is always the most exciting for everybody. And if you see the Dark Divide, oh my gosh, like every 10 seconds it seems like you're in a new dramatically different location. You're in a lava tunnel underground, you're in a rock field, you're up on the mountains, like above the snow line in a blizzard,
You're
forest,
laser
rivers.
tag.
Yeah, in laser tag.
Right.
And but we shot it all in like 22 days. So I mean, everything just was move. And but the goal was also to, you and I talked about Never Cry Wolf. And one of the things I love about Never Cry Wolf that I don't see in movies a lot anymore, you just get to sit and soak it in and get a sense of what that's like. I mean, this is a movie about a guy who takes a 6-week hike. Like, that's a slow, meditative process. And even though we were rushing around, between camera takes, when the camera was on, I really wanted to slow things down. And if you watch the movie, there's some really, really long takes in the movie. And hopefully, coming back to what you said about the theater, hopefully that lets you just kind of settle in and watch things unfold in a way that, you're not going to get if you're watching like Fast and the Furious 12.
Right. It's not the high adrenaline pump, here we go, cars flying out of planes type of thing. There's this one scene, and again, not giving anything away, there's this one scene where he walks out of the tent and he looks up in the sky and he turns around and says, "Oh, that is beautiful." And all of a sudden something happens in the sky. And I find that moment almost, I know that is a short scene. That take is probably 10 to 15 seconds, if that. And what I love is that little take feels like an hour to me when I watch it. And maybe that's what's getting at what you're talking about. It really just draws you in because the cinematography is powerful. It's very powerful. And the way you captured all of the landscape, it made me proud to be a Washingtonian, if that makes sense. It made me go, hey, everybody in the world, go see where I live, because it's the best place in the world, And
it really is.
I should say Oregonian too, because Portland's just a couple hours away from me.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's powerful. If you're listening on the podcast, I encourage you, you can go anywhere on YouTube and type in the Dark Divide trailer. There's about 10 different people that have posted it, including REI, which is an amazing company that I know, Tom, you grew up with REI probably.
Yeah,
I grew up with REI. I grew
of
up going into
course.
Seattle to buy all the gear as a kid for my scouting trips. So let's watch this, and this is taken directly from REI. I may have to edit this a little bit here, Tom.
That's okay. People can also, the trailer will pop right up if you go to darkdividefilm.com.
Yes. Okay.
So, Bob, have you ever been camping before?
Yes, of course I've been camping before.
Bob's publisher can't wait to read the first draft of his next book.
You've been talking about this for years now.
Let's dial back on you being so miserable.
I apologize, but my wife is...
Alive. I'm alive. Go look for specimens. Get away from me for a while.
I love you.
I love you more.
Am I here?
You are here.
I thought it went this way. All right, I need to go this way. Bear with me 1 second, please.
Hey, you the butterfly guy?
Well, butterfly and moth. This is north. No, this is north. Oh, where's the trail? I'm lost. Get out of the way! Hey!
How long you been on the trail?
I don't know. I guess I've lost track.
Seems ill-advised to be hiking so long without a radio or rifle. What if you run into a bear?
Why can't you see yourself as beautiful as I see you?
She thought you were a Bigfoot.
Do I look like a goddamn Bigfoot to you?
So, you're married?
I fell in love with her the second I heard her name, Tia Linnea.
Linnea. Like the little twin flowers.
Yeah, of course. The only dangerous animals I've run into are your men.
Well, you've been through an awful lot these last few years. It's only gonna get worse and worse until there ain't nothing left.
I don't know what happens next, but I'll be ready.
Beautiful trailer. When you watch that, Tom, do you just feel like you're there in those places again a little bit?
You want the honest answer? I love
Yes.
the trailer, but like every one of those locations was like a nightmare in its own way. So I was like, oh, that was the one where the gate was locked and we couldn't get in. That was the one where it started to rain. That was the one where there was an electrical storm. That was the one where there was a mountain lion.
Oh my God. Oh, did you have some mountain lions out there?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh, right on.
They're
I shouldn't
huge.
say that, but they're big guys, aren't they?
Yeah. Mountain lions and bears was the biggie, and mosquitoes, which are terrible, but like they're not going to kill you. Hopefully.
What time of year were you out there filming?
May, June.
May and June. Okay,
Uh-huh.
so getting pretty warm. Yeah.
You would think so, but our biggest problem was it was a really late winter, so a lot of the real locations were snowed in. So like every day after shooting, I jump in a car and like book up into one of the access roads to see if things had thawed out enough for us to like shoot there 3 days later.
Right. Did you shoot? I'm assuming you went and shot all the scenes where he's hiking and then the Gifford Pinchot at one time, and before that was the scenes with Tia and with going through the home and all of that.
That's
beforehand?
correct. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. So I always find that intriguing, shooting out of sequence. And do you find that as a director to be confusing for you at all?
Yeah, it's really hard, especially something like this where so much of it is David's character by himself. So, we would have days where we would shoot a scene really late in the journey where he's sunburned and all cut up and bloody and he's got claw marks on his head, and I won't explain why right now, and then he gets all cleaned up and then he's like day one of the journey. And that's really hard for an actor. And and that's certainly hard for me as a director, because you also are thinking about the shot design and how that evolves over the course of the movie. And so it's not just like a bunch of shots of feet and things. One of the biggest challenges for me is, there are outdoor movies and there are hiking movies, but one of my big issues with those is that it's just like a guy in trees, a guy in more trees, a guy in more trees. And I really wanted the look of the film to subtly evolve as the locations evolve. So I just threw it out. I wish I had it. I'd show it to you. It's like a bunch of 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper that unrolled to be like 10 feet long, where I literally mapped out the exact geography of the real hike and like where each scene was in terms of altitude and like the foliage and stuff. So I could either shoot in those real locations, or in the events where of some of them we didn't have access to, we could match those. So I would show that to David and everybody prior to shooting, like, hey, here's what happened before, here's how high we are. And that was a really cool sort of a roadmap to kind of help me drop into the story and remember sort of where we were in the chronology.
Well, and David's from Toronto, Canada, isn't he Canadian? I think
He's from Atlanta.
He's from Atlanta. Okay,
And
so
he lives in Brooklyn. And the guy's, he says he's never been camping before, so, which I would believe, and I definitely isn't going camping again after this. But
okay. I watched an interview. They did a live thing with he and Bob and Powell Books, and I went and watched that quite a while ago. And fascinating, really fun to watch what he had to say about that. But do you think so? I know that what Bob will say is that he thinks that David's character was a little less adept to being in the wilderness than he was, and he does come across that way. Sounds to me like you cast, or the perfect person was cast in this role, seeing as how David doesn't tend to be an outdoorsy kind of person. Did you find that to be a help or a hindrance?
oh, it was amazing. I mean, so yeah, Bob in reality is a pretty very adept outdoors person. Although every mishap you see in the movie really happened to him. You can read the book, but I think it's like, a movie's based on drama. When you put a lot of those mishaps in a 99-minute movie, it makes him look a lot less adept than he was.
Right.
That's also a little bit of me in the film. I'm constantly sort of stepping in stuff and tripping over things and well-meaning, but then like getting into ridiculous situations. And, I don't think anybody wants to see a movie about a guy who's a perfect hiker and outdoors person.
Well, there's thousands of those out there already.
Yeah. And I think, and David just like, he checked every box. I knew going into this, it had to be somebody who had like a very strong humanity, could make us laugh, could make us cry, which he certainly does. Is really good with the physicality of it, feels like somebody who should not be out in the wilderness. And also somebody who knows how to keep people looking at them. I mean, so much of the movie is just like David's face, and coming from his stand-up background and the variety of films he's in. I mean, from Arrested Development and the Alvin and the Chipmunks movies to, Steven Spielberg films. He has so much range, and I think it's to surprise the audience too with what he can do, because he does stuff that I don't think people have seen him do before.
It's not the David that I'm used to seeing. It really isn't at all. And jumping into, I was gonna kind of transition into this a little bit, and then I want to get back to what we were discussing, but talking about the incredible cameos that you have here. Cameron is fantastic. One of my kids looks up to her like you wouldn't believe.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's very cool. And then Deborah, my gosh, to see her, it just watching her morph. Do you know what I mean? Because I again, don't want to give too much away, but watching how she plays this character, it brought back for me, because we've all been affected by this, it brought back for me a familial a familiar feeling of a family member that went through something similar. Did you find bringing that touch of humanity into a film where I would say, I wouldn't say the majority, I'd say at least half of it, maybe majority of it, is based in the outdoors? What are those parallels you found?
Yeah, so Deborah is, amazing actress, and everybody knows her from Will and Grace, but they forget that she was in Angels in America and like
Right.
really highly trained, incredible dramatic actress. And she plays Bob's wife, Tia, who's a real person and amazing person. And a lot of people don't realize it's Deborah walking into the movie until they get to the end credits. I mean, she really is transformed. She talked to all of Tia's kids. When you see her in the film, a lot of the jewelry and clothing she's wearing were Tia's.
Oh, amazing.
She really disappeared into that role. And that was really exciting for me because she does have a comedic background. So like David, she really understands not just how to play a well-rounded character that sometimes you like, and sometimes they do things that are unlikable, but you really like feel the humanity.
Did you select the music for this film?
So one of the guys involved with the film had a connection to the Avett Brothers record label. So when you watch the film, most of the music is by the Avett Brothers. And then there are a number of songs from an amazing Choctaw singer who lives in Oklahoma named Samantha Crane, who's blowing up now. Her music's in Reservation Dogs, and her voice is just amazing. And then there's music by a number of other artists, including Chris Novoselic from Nirvana. And we were really lucky because a lot of these people really responded to the story. They loved what we were doing with it. And they agreed before we started filming for us to be able to use their music. And as a director, that's amazing because every scene that you see, I shot knowing what the piece of music was going to be. So I would be listening to it from the location scouting to driving to set to while we were filming. And it really helped inform like the rhythms of each scene. Mm-hmm. Normally you get the music at the end, and then you have to kind of recut a little bit, and you're always like, oh, it's not as good as the stuff I was hoping I would get. And this was like one of those just like miracles to get all of this great music ahead of time.
As a musician, I try to pride myself on really discovering unknown types of singers, bands, all that kind of thing. And Dark Divide opened up a whole new, I know there's a genre, people call it folk rock, all that type of thing. I call it mountain music. I call it
I like that.
I call it modern John Denver in a way, but with some real beautiful stories behind it. And I pull out my uke and I play the Avett Brothers all the time.
Cool.
I just love jamming to them. And Samantha Crane, whenever I go hiking, I try to do a solo hike at least once every 2 weeks if I can get away. And it's Samantha's music that's pumping in my ears if I have headphones on. Usually I'm just listening to the wilderness. But if I need a little something, it's Samantha. So, Tom, I wanted to jump to another topic that's really close to me and personal to me, and that is the Native American aspect of this. And I know I'm so sorry I forget the actress's name, but she's fantastic.
Kimberly Guerrero.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm sorry that I forgot her name. And then Dave Ketchner is in there, and Diami Thomas, I believe, is there. And
Mm-hmm.
What a powerful scene, and so much comes out during this one scene. And if you watched the trailer, you saw them creep up on David with a gun. Do I look like a goddamn Bigfoot to you? So that's a great scene. I wanted to ask about why you decided to incorporate this part. We're talking about the native terms for the mountains and all that type of thing. Well,
one of the messages of Bob's book that I hope we incorporate in the film is the idea that, it's a book that deals with Bigfoot, but what it really is a message that at the end of the day, what Bigfoot represents is almost as important as whether or not Bigfoot really exists, which is our connection with nature and a link back to a time when we were a part of nature more and not as like separated from it. And Bob's book really got into that in depth. The Yakima and Cowlitz tribes in particular, who we worked with very closely on the film, have lived there for untold generations. And I wanted to share their perspective on the forest, which I think is a very powerful perspective, and one that I think people are finally starting to come around to after the fires that we've been having. A number of the places we filmed in the movie burned last year. And the way that they take on forest management and the way that they view their place in the ecosystem there was so powerful. I couldn't imagine not doing that. So when we were developing the script and casting it, we worked very closely with the Yakima Nation, the Cowlitz Nation, and the Warm Springs Nation, not only to cast some of the roles, but to make sure that the scenes we were putting, they read and gave notes on those scenes and then looked at the cut scenes to make sure that we were portraying them accurately and in a way that they're not used to seeing. I mean, there's a pretty narrow bandwidth for like how Native Americans are portrayed in movies and TV shows. And we wanted to do something that was very different, to the point where that whole big scene around the fire, we actually filmed it. We filmed that on a sacred land for the Warm Springs tribe. So we went to them and they read the scene and they gave us permission to film there. So I would do a ceremony each day before we filmed to honor the spirits in that area. And I don't know, I think it really kind of felt like a very special place to shoot that particular scene. So we tried to really incorporate that. And I think that's also a turning point for Bob's character in the film, because he starts to reevaluate how he sees his role in nature. He goes into the film he talks about it early on in the film in the bookstore scene, that he's an observer. His job is to observe. And he slowly starts to realize he's not an observer. The story of the forest is his story. And that scene is like a big turning point for him. And then it was important to me to show Native American people in a leadership role, which is why there's a whole big sequence where he stumbles into a logging camp. And Gary Farmer, who's a legendary Native actor, he plays the foreman there. And he's definitely like in charge of that scene. And I thought that was really cool too, to see someone in a role that wasn't like, this has to be a Native actor. And so hopefully that kind of just informs the whole texture of the movie.
Well, and that's a great transition into my next question, was about that scene where you have Bob's character come up to the foreman, and he's just been, if you will, he's having a conflict with the logging community, and then they have this back and forth dialogue that is very powerful, and it's fairly quick, but it hits some very major topics, and something that's really a hot topic up here in the Pacific Northwest. What caused you to bring up the topic of logging? Should it be, should it not be? And I know it could have gone, you can talk for years on that, I'm sure, but why did you bring that dialogue into this film?
So when Bob's book takes place in 1995,
right,
clear-cut logging is still huge. I mean, it's still happening, but it was much bigger. That was right in the middle of the spotted owl news story, where essentially, for those listeners or viewers not old enough to remember, the spotted owl was an endangered owl, and if the logging companies were allowed to proceed with their plans, they would have wiped them out. So it was one of the early waves of like environmentalists having direct action and sabotaging logging equipment, and then loggers getting very aggressive, because these people all live in those areas. These loggers live there and they fish there and they hike there and they enjoy the woods as much as anybody else, but they also need to make a living. And I like to think of myself as pretty progressive, and definitely not a fan of clear cutting. That's something we could talk about for hours.
Sure.
But Bob wrote a book called Wintergreen that really is a thick book, and it deals with that. And he talks about how loggers will like show up at his house and track him down to get their copies autographed and say like, hey, thank you for like giving a more well-rounded perspective. And you don't walk away from that book saying like, yeah, let the logging companies do whatever they want, but it reminds you about how the people that work there do care about the forests as well. And it was a really interesting scene to do because it reflected a lot of what was in the book, in that David's character goes into that logging camp with one idea, and he doesn't change his mind when he leaves, but it helps him understand that there's a lot of perspectives and things aren't as just simple. The solutions aren't as simple as he would have thought going into it.
This hit me because one of my friends is an elder in the Yakima tribe, and he also was with a forestry service of sorts, and we would go out and he would show me in old growth forests in the Cascades, and we went out this particular time. It was about a year ago, and we talked a lot about the timber on the ground, and we talked about the old growth trees, and he liked to mention the kindling, if you will. And so you have a native perspective who's talking about what happens when the forests aren't maintained, and I did not expect that. I really didn't. I grew up just thinking all logging is bad. We should leave all the trees alone. I didn't consider how it would affect economy. I didn't consider how it might affect the nature. So the way you had those two sides of the dialogue, if you will, and I shouldn't polarize that dialogue, but it does kind of sense that one's from
Naturally
one, one's from the other.
polarized.
Yeah. And so that was a very powerful scene. And I would suggest people watching the film that they really look at both sides open-mindedly. I think it's pretty powerful.
Well, in the movie, I want to be really clear. This
Sure.
is not a pro-logging movie.
No.
So like, if you see that scene, that's why there's that big giant wide shot at the end. Like, that's a real working logging site, and it's awful. And I mean, what we think of as forests in Oregon and Washington are mostly just tree farms now. There's not the biodiversity that a healthy forest needs. So I did think it was important to share that perspective, and for people to understand there's like a cause and effect and collateral damage with like any decision you make. Yeah, and leaving, as we're learning, I work a lot with firefighters in my other job as a documentary filmmaker, and our fire suppression, the way that we handle forest management and deal with forest fires has been a disaster. And you see that by how the fires are getting worse every year, and global warming certainly plays into that, but also how we manage our forests and don't realize how fire can be useful has created a lot of the problems that we have now.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you see people, just kind of throwing caution to the wind, that are not respecting nature and are, having gender reveal parties, in a dry field where things blow up and causes issues. I have to ask about the lava tubes. My younger brother and I are hiking Ape Canyon next weekend. And
wow.
I summited Lewitt, Mount St. Helens. I summited it last year in the snow with my other brother. We got about half a mile from the top and then had a whiteout, and we wanted to survive, so we turned around. But
That's good.
We're gonna hit Ape Canyon, and I'm very excited because this is where, kind of in the area where this film takes place, a little bit. It's a little further north and to the east. But I wanted to ask about the Big Red Lava Bed, and I know there's a chapter in his book where Bob talks about getting lost. Everything. It's a labyrinth, and he turns around, and it's incredible. I don't remember. I think it's like 2,000 miles of tubes or something like that, or 200
It's
miles.
crazy.
Yeah, tell me about that a little bit.
So there's this whole big sequence where he gets lost in the big lava beds, and that's every friggin' shot of that is in the real location. There's a thing where he's under these natural bridges and he's looking at the moss. That's the exact natural bridge and moss that he describes in his book. The big lava beds are like, imagine a thing that was square miles of lava that over the years trees have grown up, but like you walk around and every time you step, you hear like boom, 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 because it's hollow underneath. That's where there were mountain lions and bears and mosquitoes. And everything is like razor sharp, right? It's pumice. So Bob got lost there. We stupidly decided we'll film there, and it was hard. It was hard. And then so there's a whole sequence where he goes down into the lava tunnels and gets horribly lost, and some very scary stuff happens. And it's also a moment of sort of his dark, to have a little Joseph Campbell, like his darkest hour and his rebirth and all that good stuff. And those are all filmed in the real lava tubes underneath the big lava beds. There were a number of issues because a number of the lava tubes have bats in them, and you cannot film in those because we can bring in I forget what it's called. It's like called a white nose disease or something that can kill the bats. So we found this mile-long. Well, maybe just explain to you. Okay, so the lava tube where you get that we filmed in, which you could like park a 747 in. It looks like the lair from like a bad guy in a James Bond movie.
So cool. Batman's cave.
Exactly. So you drive deep into the Gifford Pinchot and you're following directions. Then you turn down a dirt road. You drive miles down this dirt road. And then there's a gate. Nice new gate with like a combination lock on it. Put the combination in, you open the gate. You drive like miles more down this private road through the trees. And in the middle of nowhere, there's an A-frame cabin. Looks like something out of Evil Dead. And you go in the cabin, and it's like small cabin, and there's a living room with like an old tube TV and a hot plate and a musty bed and stuff. And then you open this closet door, and there's this industrial stairway leading down like 150 feet into this guy's loft. It's like the full-on Scooby-Doo. It's crazy.
Holy cow.
So the guy who owned this property, his grandfather had like fallen through a hole and discovered it. So it's like all their private property. So yeah, so we filmed this whole thing in there. That was all shot in one day. Very gnarly shoot. Like you'll see stuff with like all this stuff floating in the air. That's not movie magic. That was all in there. And
no way.
Can
I ask about the hieroglyphs?
The hieroglyphs we added digitally. They're real native hieroglyphs that we then superimposed because we obviously didn't want to paint in the lava tunnel.
Right.
And occasionally you'd hear like a giant rock fall somewhere in the lava tunnel.
Oh.
And it's also freezing cold. It's like it's at most 50 degrees, probably in the 40s. And that whole sequence, David's just in his underpants. And here he is like running around and falling in this thing where everything's razor sharp and it's wet and freezing cold. And it was a lot, man. So those hieroglyphs we added digitally. That story is a combination of Bob's story and a story that's in his book that's told by John Muir's guide, who was a famous soldier, and what happened to him when he got lost in the same lava tubes. So
when he was lost, yes.
Yeah, it's intense. It was a intense scene to watch, and it was a very intense scene to make. I think there's a sequence there. It's one of my favorite in the film where, without giving too much away, Bob thinks this is the end. And it's one of those long takes where we just sit and watch him kind of fall apart. And there's a lot of acting happening there, but I know he was pretty scared too.
Sure.
So it's that's one of those things where the line between documentary and reality got blurred a little bit.
And you said that was a one-day shoot?
Yeah, all that lava stuff we shot in one day, which was brutal.
I suppose you're not dependent on the light of day for filming when you're down at a cave. So that may be easier.
But you need some light. So it's like, how do we like sneak lights in so you can see this big giant cave without it feeling lit,
Yeah, I have to tell you, when I watch that scene, the thing that gets me is I always thought you must have used some studio, you must have used some green screen, if you will, and you're telling me now that was all filmed right in that cave, and it's huge, like you were saying earlier. That's mind-blowing, and I love that you were able to avoid the studio for that scene. That's movie magic. That is the real magic. It's the real filming.
I mean, we had so little money to make this movie. So it was just about, we got to find real locations and somehow drag everybody out there, which is like no easy feat. 'Cause even on a tiny film, you're talking about like 25, 30 people.
Sure. Speaking of funding, did you find it difficult when you pitched this film because Bigfoot is around and it wasn't the main topic, but it is a topic. Was that difficult? Did you get people slamming it down?
So I've probably written 30 screenplays. I've been lucky enough to sell a few of them. And I swear to you, every script I write, I'm like, this is my best. This is the best script ever. This is the one.
Right
and
on.
this was the script that I wrote and was just like, why did I do this? Nobody's going to want this. So of course, that's the one that gets made. Yeah, nobody wanted it. I mean, it's like a period piece about a shy butterfly expert who goes on a 6-week trek by himself through the wilderness after something very heavy happens. Oh, and it's got Bigfoot in it and butterflies and stunts and like weather issues. And he doesn't talk for like 38 minutes of the movie. Yeah, everybody was like, well, that's the least commercial thing I've ever read. But after just like, at that point, I want to say like 8 years of just like hustling it. My friend Jory Weitz, who's kind of a legendary casting director. He cast Napoleon Dynamite and Blade and worked on Dances with Wolves and Edward Scissorhands. I randomly ran into him and we went for coffee and got to chatting about the script. And he was like, hey, can I read it? And I sent it to him and he loved it. And he became like the first cheerleader when I was just like done with it, and encouraged me and helped me do a big rewrite on it, and just was like, let's figure out how to get this made. This is going to be a great movie. And he was the like spark that started it. And after a couple years of us trying to build momentum with it, I met Ryan Frost and Aaron Boyd, and they have a company called Public House that's done some really great movies. And we met for lunch, and they said a thing that nobody ever says, which was, what's the craziest, most difficult project you have? And I was like, oh, I have the project for you. And I gave it to them and they loved it. And that was the thing that really started the fire under it. And so with their partnership, we were able to start going out to actors, and we got David and we got Deborah, and then the movie happened. I mean, it was 10 years. That's a long time to work on something.
Yes.
And I also got to give credit to Bob Pyle. Like, he hung in there and he believed in me. And I'm sure he never thought anything was ever going to actually happen with this.
He seems like the most genuine, kind person. Just a really good dude.
Yeah. And like, David is like my height. So he's like a smaller dude and stuff. But like the real Bob Pyle, it's like talking to Gandalf. He's like 6 foot, I don't know what. And he has this big voice and this big bushy beard and this walking stick. Yeah, he's just this gentle giant of a guy. And, you know, he came to set a couple times and he would cry when he saw real. Imagine how weird that is to see like some of the most important moments in your life being acted in front of you with actors who you recognize. And like when you see, I talked about that bedroom scene, all that artwork is Tia's real artwork. I mean, it's a lot.
It gives you shivers. It absolutely gives you shivers. I just, as a quick side note here, when he's sitting on his porch, Bob is, and he's typing, he's typing on his little word processor. This is 1995. I was my sophomore year at university with the exact same word processor, or it looks exactly the same. So I feel his pain when it comes to writing on a word processor. That was before we had all these computers and we were squishing them in our dorm rooms or fraternities. So I love that. I love that you bring in that touch of the mid 90s and how it felt. And I can imagine writing it and then watching things change in our world over those 10 years. Did that have any effect on the rewriting process at all? What's happening in the world? Or did you try to stay true kind of to that first feeling?
No, it kept evolving. It's amazing because like I got divorced and went through a lot of loss while I was working on the script. Bob had a tremendous amount of loss in his life, and the script just sort of kept evolving to reflect that. And in a way, as difficult as it was, having 10 years to write and rewrite something, I think as simple as the movie, I would imagine seems, there's a lot of little moments and sort of depth to it. It's funny, even Bob, who it's all based on his life and real work, he called me just a few weeks ago and was like, hey, I was watching the movie again, and this scene with the glove box, that's from a poem I wrote. I'm like, yeah, man, that's you. You wrote that. and he didn't even realize it because it had sort of moved and morphed around so much and like landed in the middle of another scene that he wrote. So it's yeah, I think that movie really sort of reflects a lot of where I am as a person and a lot of Bob's own journey that I've watched the last 10 years.
I think that's why it resonates with me as well. It came at a time in my life when I was going through transition, and it's a powerful thing. And watching somebody go through something and what happens in the end and how they evolve as a person, I think you captured that brilliantly.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me ask a question here that I think will be fun to answer, or maybe not. What's the craziest thing that happened on set to you over your span as a director? Any just bizarre, weird thing?
On this movie?
Oh, on any movie. Your experience as a director.
This was so I come from a documentary world, and like I spent 14 months with the busiest fire department in America in Detroit, and like running in and out of burning buildings. And I made a movie out in the Aleutians in Alaska about a World War II battle that happened. It got stuck in like an unmarked minefield and would trip over unexploded bombs. And like I've gone on tour with gangster rappers and gotten in arguments with the ATF. And so like for me on this movie, where I'm not kidding, like the crew was amazing. But every day they were like, that's the worst. That was like the most difficult day shooting I've ever had. Every day was like that. So
wow.
Like there was a day, so there's the sequence where he's camping alongside the lake and whistling. And then in the morning, he has an interaction with like a Forest Service trail crew, and there's some stuff. So that day, which seems like a really mellow day, was the worst day.
Really?
Like we got there and the Forest Service hadn't opened the gate, so we couldn't get in, and all the like rigs piled up. There was a thunder and lightning storm. So there was a whole other sequence that I'd spent 10 years writing where he goes out into the lake and there's a lady bathing across the lake, and she's a cancer survivor, and they have this like amazing moment, silent moment across the lake. But we cast a real cancer survivor. We worked with women's breast cancer group in Oregon, and it was like they were so excited because it showed a woman who's a cancer survivor just out like experiencing life, which she wasn't portrayed as a victim at all. And we couldn't film it. And instead, like there's a sequence where you see David's character like fighting his way through in a really wide shot of this massive rainstorm. That was the rainstorm that happened. So I was like, we got to film something, like get out there and
let's do it.
Yeah. And that day they had a tornado in Portland, which never happens. It touched down, went one block, and dropped a tree on our production van. It was the only thing that got wrecked.
I remember that day.
And I remember them calling about the tornado, like we whatever, first tornado in Portland, it destroyed one thing, and it was our van. And that was only like the third worst thing that happened that day.
Oh, geez. And here it comes. Film production crew.
So that day also there's a sequence where David's character falls in the water. And that water is snow runoff. And we had to do the take twice. And it was so cold that for like 2 hours, David was borderline in shock. And we had medics there, and a hot, warm shower for him and stuff, but still he couldn't speak, didn't know where he was for a couple hours. Like we were just like this close to sending him to the hospital. That was a crazy day.
Well, and you're in the springtime. I do some winter swimming out here in our rivers, and it's taken me a lot. And I will literally go in 20 to 30 seconds and I'm out. And I live on a river here, so I try to do it once a week. But I know that feeling, I know that pain, and it's dangerous. And I think a lot of people take for granted when they see these, being an actor is so easy, no problem. I think it's probably one of the most difficult jobs out there, to be honest.
Dude, so he had a wetsuit on even, and it didn't, I mean, it was still a mess. Like if you look at him and how beat up he is in that movie, a great makeup person, but a lot of that is real stuff. I mean, there's a moment where he's dangling off the side of I think it's a 350-foot cliff. That's really David Cross hanging on that cliff. And he wanted to do his own stunts. There's a thing where a giant tree almost crushes him. That's a real tree we cut down with a chainsaw. Like, it's that's the thing I think is easy to gloss over because people just assume that that's all digital, and it's not. Like if you see David Cross out there in the middle of some crazy thing, that's him. And I got to give the guy credit. Like we had stunt guys and all that stuff, and they were awesome. But more often than not, David was like, "Hey, you want to see my face, right? Like let's use me." So hopefully that adds to the realism of the film. And the butterflies were not easy to deal with either. There's like 200 butterfly shots in the movie.
Mm-hmm. Did you have a butterfly Wrangler?
Yeah, we did. So of those 200 plus shots, only 3 of the shots the butterflies digitally created because we needed it to like fly a certain direction at night, which was like just never going to happen. So we had a guy who's like one of the premier butterfly people in the Pacific Northwest, and his name's Dana. And those are all the real correct butterflies for each scene. And they're real. In some cases, we have the real butterfly there in the moment. And in some cases, we filmed it without the butterfly. And then in a parking lot in Portland, filmed it in front of a green screen to match the shots and put it in. And you can't direct butterflies. It's terrible. But I wanted all the butterflies to be accurate because I know all the lepidopterists, all the butterfly experts were going to see it.
Right.
And we also, you cannot film with a butterfly outside of its native habitat because if it gets away, you don't want to introduce an invasive species, and you have to film during the season. So it was, and we filmed not knowing if it was going to work either, which was really bananas.
Did you time when you filmed based on butterfly migration?
We tried to, but the migration ended up late that year. So there are a couple cases where we have real butterflies. In particular, there's a thing called the Ghost Moth. That's a seemingly luminescent moth at night.
He writes about it in the book.
Yeah, such a great moment in the book.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then we had to go back like at the end of July during the migration window so that we could film with the correct butterflies during their season.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Well,
the owl, there's a whole thing with an owl you saw in the trailer.
That was the next thing I was going to ask. The owl.
That's a real owl. And I'm not going to tell you what the owl does, but it did it. And
yeah, that's fantastic.
Nobody else has ever done that. I don't think anybody's going to do it again. And that was really scary because an owl is like, I thought it would be light. Owls are heavy and they have these long claws and they're kind of trainable, but kind of not. They're kind of a wild animal.
Yeah, just a little bit. Do you, what breed of owl was that?
So in the real story, it's a spotted owl, and it is illegal to train and illegal to film spotted owls, as it turns out.
Okay. I
did not know that until we were up in Oregon getting ready to shoot. That scene happened to take place in Oregon in an amazing piece of old growth forest. And so instead we got I forget what kind of owl. There's basically 2 trained owls in America, and we got one, and he flew out from Georgia. The owl, this is a true story. The owl flew on United, and the trainers flew on Southwest because the owl needed better accommodations than the trainers. And so the owl, and then we digitally made the owl spotted, but like everything you see the owl do, it did. So we had to train it to fly and do some stuff. And it turns out how you get an owl to do something is they love mice, frozen mice, and an owl can eat like 3 frozen mice. So I basically had 3 shots at shooting that entire scene, which is a big scene where the owl does a bunch of stuff. So I'm like, what? I need him to do more than 3 things. What are we going to do? So there's a thing where there's a certain point where they're taking the frozen mice and they're throwing them at David, and these slimy frozen mice are hitting him in the face. And then I would use the piece after the slimy thing had fallen off. Oh, it was really, there's a bunch of stuff in this movie that we went into like, are we going to be able, everybody's saying this is impossible. How are we going to film this? And the owl was a big one.
Yeah.
It's a cool scene.
It's a very cool scene. And the timing of it is beautiful. It is beautiful when it happens. Again, I won't give that away, but where you place that scene in the movie, it just feels like the sequence of the movie. And And like you said at the beginning of our discussion, it's who wants to watch? I mean, I'm sure that people do, but when you watch a guy go out into the woods and that's all you see, and you were able to go and create this conversation between Bob out in the woods and Bob's life before and during and possibly after the woods, and intersperse them so that they actually build to the next scene in the woods, if you know what I mean. It
Mhm.
really, without saying this happened, then this happened, then this happened. I love that. And I would love to see more film that grabs that kind of timeline, besides Quentin Tarantino, but that where they manipulate the timeline. And I think that's very powerful, Tom. Very powerful.
Oh, thanks. And I mean, I think that's my documentary training, in that I try to cut things so they flow emotionally rather than chronologically. And I mean, that's certainly the case in this movie, where there's a I mean, it's overall a chronological film, but as you pointed out, there's stuff interweaved throughout all of it. And the finished movie is, I want to say it's 106 minutes, I think. Like the original cut of it was like 3.5 hours. There's so much stuff that's not in the final movie. And in a way that was kind of super sad, but also it was great because I had so many ingredients to play with and reorder, and sort of, I mean, we couldn't reorder it much because he gets increasingly beat up. His glasses get cracked. So it's like, you can't put certain scenes out of order. But having all that additional material really was like making a documentary, where you got to just sort of like slowly like chisel it down into its final form.
I think that's what's most apparent to me as I watch this film, is it feels like a documentary. Like we said earlier, feels like the documentary combined with the fiction. Speaking of documentaries, I could talk about Dark Divide all day. We'll come back to that in just a second, but I have
Okay.
to ask about your upcoming project. When when I grew up in eighth grade, 1989, NWA was the thing to listen to, and then
Yeah.
came this group called Insane Clown Posse. What is going on, Tom? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
It's your upcoming project, is that right?
Yeah, it premieres in like 2 weeks.
Oh, I can't wait.
So it's the complete other end of the movie spectrum. So for the last 7 years, I and my co-director Brenna Sanchez have been making a documentary about and with this band called Insane Clown Posse, who, if you know about them, you definitely know about them. And if you don't, it's a band that's been around since the early 90s. They dress like clowns, like John Wayne Gacy, like killer clowns, and they sing rap music, but like with horror movie lyrics and stuff. And they're typically voted the most hated band in America, and yet they have 1 million fans that love them. They're called Juggalos. And people hate Juggalos just about as much as they hate the band, which is a lot. And yet for 30 years, they're like deadheads, like their whole life revolve around the band. So 7 years ago, the band and all of its fan base got declared a gang by the FBI. This has never happened before, that a fan base was declared a gang. So at first the band, and we've been filming throughout this whole process, and at first the band thought it was a joke and like, hey, we're gang leaders, haha. And then they started getting these reports back from Juggalos who were like having their lives turned upside down by this, because guess what? Once you're declared a gang member, you get kicked out of the military. You have an ICP tattoo, guess what? You're getting kicked out of the military. Can't get a student loan, can't get social services. So we had cases of like a guy whose son was taken away and put in a group home for 6 years because he had an ICP poster on his wall, and that's considered gang paraphernalia. People who lost their jobs, people who are just driving with a bumper sticker, they get pulled over, photographed, they go in the gang database, it's probable cause. Guys arrested for minor infractions who get gang enhancements. It was crazy. And so the ACLU stepped in and backed a lawsuit against the FBI. And it turns out the FBI has no criteria for what makes a gang. It's kind of arbitrary, and nobody's ever gotten off the gang list. So we followed this whole process with the band, and we go home with the band, which nobody's done before. and spend time with different juggalos whose lives have been turned upside down. And at one point, the ATF shows up, and I won't tell you what happens, but it's not pretty. And follow it as this winds through the court case and through the court of public opinion until the case ultimately currently it's one circuit beneath the Supreme Court. But the movie's premiering at Fantastic Fest in Austin at the end of September, and then it will be out in theaters a little later this year.
So is it going to be mainstream theaters, or is it going to be independent house theaters?
Both. It'll be
Okay.
it should be at a fairly wide release.
Okay.
And in fact, if you look closely in The Dark Divide, there are 5 Insane Clown Posse references in the movie. And
Are you a fan? Are you a jungle?
I'd never even heard their music before I made the movie.
Okay.
I will say, like, a lot of the music is super fun. A lot of their fans are people that have gone through really tough times, and it's the only music that's speaking to experiences like they've had, and they've created a family and something that's really positive. And I think it's insane to criminalize people because of the music they listen to. I mean, that's a slippery slope. Like, I live in LA. You want to talk about Raiders fans? Like, you want to talk about gangs that wear Dodgers caps or wear Cubs caps or have, like, it would be pretty easy to start declaring a lot of other groups a gang, which is what the ACLU is most afraid of. So it's one of the best concerts you'll ever go to. And the Juggalos are some of the nicest people I've ever met. All please and thank you. Hey, can we help you carry your gear? Not knowing who we are or anything. And I think it's a free country, and they should be left alone to do whatever they want.
Amen, brother. I couldn't agree with you more. How did you jump into this project?
So Brenna and I made a Detroit firefighting documentary called Burn that played like everywhere. A couple of years before we started the ICP thing, and the guys from the band had come to the theater and had seen the movie and were fans of it. They're from Detroit. And we then read a New York Times story about them and them reaching this turning point. And Brenna comes, she was editor for a number of major music magazines and comes from Detroit and was very involved in the music scene there, and just like reached out to them and said, hey, this seems like it would be an interesting documentary. And they said, can you have a camera crew here tomorrow? Because we're going to give a press conference that we're suing the FBI. So we just like jumped into it and have just been hanging in there with them as the story got like crazier and crazier and crazier.
And you said 7 years in the making?
Yeah.
I can't wait. And so people need to keep an eye out for the theater release coming up here soon. Good luck to you in Austin. That is amazing. Quick question. I want to read a quote from this book. This is Where Bigfoot Walks by Robert Michael Pyle. And I'm showing my age right now because I just put my reading glasses on.
I mean,
it's what it is, isn't it? What are your thoughts on Bigfoot? And I can't do a cryptid podcast or show without asking your own personal thoughts.
we've hardly talked about Bigfoot. I know.
Was the point. That was the point. It's okay. I don't mind that at all. Because I think we've talked about Bigfoot a lot, to be honest. We've talked about nature. We've talked about the Native Americans. They're all intertwined, but Bigfoot specifically, that's correct. So before I read Bob's quote, tell me your thoughts on Bigfoot.
And we're a really unique Bigfoot movie. There's some amazing encounters that Bob had that I think are really powerful that were like verbatim in the movie. And we tried to present that in the way they happened. I've seen a lot of things in my life that I can't explain. I have not seen Bigfoot, but I've spent enough time in those forests to know that we're just like a little piece of the story. And just because we haven't discovered something yet doesn't mean it exists, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And there is such a huge body of evidence. Either it's the biggest conspiracy in history,
Right.
or something's going on.
Let me read this quote real quick here and see what you think about it. This is near kind of the end where he's going through and he's talking about what he believes. It says further analysis of the Patterson Gimlin film. There have been several of these conducted in sophisticated media laboratories. They all agree within a narrow range of the mathematics, kinetics, and dynamics of the film and the subject it depicts, including the Superman stride length of some 7 feet. The fluid movement of the muscles in the thigh, the heft of the breast, and other traits are stunning. In these days of CMG, graphic interface, it will be very difficult to make a case for the authenticity of any fresh photographic evidence, but given the technology of the times, that 16 millimeter motion picture camera rented from a drugstore, Patterson Gimlin remains, for now, the Teflon clue in the case. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's how many people, it's like that thing's like the Zapruder film from the Kennedy assassination. So many people have looked at it and nobody's been able to pick it apart. I don't want to speak for Bob, but I'll speak for Bob a little bit in that, you know, since the book was written, he's had other experiences that he, I think now would tell you he's a believer. And he's a scientist also. I mean, he's a Yale trained, you know, he wrote the Audubon Field Guide to North American Butterflies. He's a nationally regarded expert in his field.
Multiple awards, yeah.
Yeah, and what he would say is, hey, there's a theory that there's a large hominid that lives in the woods of the Pacific Northwest, and here's how it operates and things. And nobody's disproven that. So as a scientist, you can't say that it's not true because it hasn't been disproven. And again, for me, I want to live in a world where Bigfoot's possible, where magic's possible. And we don't know everything, and we are surprised, and we are connected to nature more than we realize or remember. What's bad about that?
I think that that's a great place to leave this, Tom, is that there's mystery out there. And I think when somebody captures it the way you have, it's fascinating to me. And I can't thank you enough. I have many, many skeptics who think I'm a crazy person in my life, and that's okay. And one of those skeptics, crazy person, is the person that told me about the Dark Divide. And that's what's amazing to me, because he says to me, oh, there's a Bigfoot movie coming out. I went, what? I'll go check it out. And then I did all the research and I found out, well, it's not a Bigfoot movie, but it's, you know, and it's fascinating. And now that person is completely drawn into your storytelling, which is a very important thing, because it's not a cryptid movie, you know, it's a life movie. And I think that's powerful, Tom. I think you've done amazing things. It feels to me like everything came together for this film. You say that the weather went, you know, bonkers, but you were able to film. You had amazing cast. You had some incredible cameos. Like I said earlier, watching Cameron Esposito in a gas station is fantastic.
She's amazing.
Her. She's so great. So, I just want to say thanks again, Tom, for being here. I wish I could talk to you for hours, but I am really looking forward to the ICP documentary, Insane Clown Posse documentary. I'm going to be watching with bated breath, having spent time with you and learning more about you. And I just want to tell listeners, you can rent or purchase The Dark Divide. It is on Amazon. You can also go to the Dark Divide Film, I believe.
DarkDivideFilm.com, and there's a list of places where you can get it or watch it.
Yes, and if you've ever been interested in the Gifford Pinchot Forest, that guy's story is actually really interesting too. Or Mount St. Helens, Mount Adams, you know, the Diamond, Mount Hood, and then Mount Rainier, which I basically live in the foothills of Mount Rainier. There is some incredible Washington cinematography. So do jump on and watch that. And the way Tom has captured it, not just being from the Northwest, but also having an affinity for growing up in that area, I think is spectacular. So Tom, thank you. I can't thank you enough, and it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me on the show and all the great perceptive questions.
Absolutely.
Something Cryptid, This Way Comes is a production of Old Mountain Media. Visit us on Instagram at PNW Sasquatch Shadows and Facebook at Old Mountain Media.
Something Cryptid, This Way Comes.